Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon with all of you. And please, continue to eat, get up, whatever else you need while I talk through my slides. We have a full hour, so my intent is to provide a little bit of an overview of my experiences and some thoughts about bringing the patient voice to drug development. But then we wanted to leave certainly plenty of time for discussion and Q&A towards the end of the hour. I do want to note that you don't need to worry about taking notes. We do have handouts of my slides. Stacks should have been put on each of your tables so you can follow along or just grab one at the end for your own reference. I'm a drug development attorney with the firm of Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara that's based here in Washington, D.C. Been with the firm for about 3.5 years, where I've been working primarily with drug developers and patient advocacy organizations on their regulatory needs. So determining what they need to do to advance towards development and ultimately approval with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So that's the lens that I kind of come to this with. And as previously mentioned, I was at FDA prior to that for 6 years not as a lawyer, but as a patient liaison, actually working to help bring the patient voice into FDA's regulatory decisions, and worked on a number of programs there that you'll actually be hearing about later on today from our FDA speaker. So for the talk, I was asked to cover opportunities and the framework for engaging both for industry and investigators, which I've kind of grouped together as clinical trial sponsors. So whether you're an investigator, often you will be an investigator sponsor of your own research, or much of the time, the investigators in the room, you're asked by industry sponsors to be a key opinion leader or KOL, and help inform the design and conduct of industry studies. We'll first address those stakeholders, and then we'll move into patient engagement with regulators, being the FDA. I think it's important before we dive in to note that while it might seem obvious on its face that patients should have a voice in drug development, and although certain patient communities certainly have for many decades now even, for example, the HIV/AIDS patient advocates in the late 80s and early 90s certainly had a voice, and the cancer patients in the 90s really spoke up and were a second large patient constituency to really have a voice in these types of processes. It has not always been systematic or proactive, for sure. So I share with you this quote. This is a quote from the Food and Drug Administration that they put out in one of their public documents in 2012. And I think it really demonstrates the shift towards this recognition that patients are also experts in their disease. They are very important experts and have very unique experiences and preferences that need to be shared in order for there to be productive drug development in this country. And so this is something that has, in my experience, has really been taken to heart by all across the Food and Drug Administration. And now they have put out many more programs and opportunities for patient engagement just in the last 5 years that never were there before. So now to kind of dive into how those of you in the room that are patients or patient advocates might be able to work with industry and investigators that are here, and vice versa, how those of you that are clinical trial sponsors can look to engage with patients. So first, what is, there's always the question of what is the value proposition for engaging with patients? It adds time to your process of designing clinical trials. There's often, that it requires even the need for additional resources and staff to be available to engage with patients in a meaningful way. But what I would like to propose to you is that the value proposition is actually in favor of engaging with patients. Engaging with patients will actually help de-risk, especially early engagement with patients will help de-risk your development programs, even from the basic science kind of research phase all the way through clinical development. From the FDA kind of regulatory perspective, one of the things that we always hear drug developers asking for is more regulatory certainty. If I develop a product in a certain way, if I'm successful, can I expect a certain regulatory outcome? Well, I would also assert that engaging with patients provides more regulatory certainty. When there's better information symmetry about patients' experiences and their preferences across industry, FDA, and the patient community, I think the foundation and framework for then assessing the benefits and risks of those products and the level of certainty in the information generated from research is uniform, and there is then therefore more certainty. In addition, there's just kind of very practical reasons that engaging with patients is valuable. I'll walk through some of these in more detail as we go through the slides, but you can actually plan more effective, efficient trials by engaging with patients. There's actually been research that shows that if you get patient input on clinical trial design, there will be fewer protocol amendments and greater recruitment and retention. These are things that sponsors of clinical trials struggle with all the time and cost a lot of money and delays to deal with. So there's that value proposition. But then probably one of the most important things, and I'm sure every patient in the room and every physician in the room wants this, which is more meaningful information to be generated from research to help them inform your individual treatment decisions. And so if you engage with patients, make sure you're looking at the things that are really important to them. When those clinical trials conclude and you have results, you'll then have better information to inform treatment decisions. It's also better information for regulators to be able to make those approval decisions. So you might wonder, where really can a patient or a patient advocate contribute to the process? Where does this expertise you speak of kind of help provide inputs? Well, there's many, more than I have time to talk about today. I'm certainly going to try to address some of these, but as you can see across the chevron from pre-discovery of a therapeutic all the way through preclinical, so the animal testing development, through the 3 phases of clinical studies in humans, and ultimately with FDA review and approval, and even into the post-marketing setting once a product is approved and on the market. Each of those different phases has very important opportunities for patients to engage. And I want to share with you some of those that I think might be relevant to the audience here today. So the first is in the research priority setting. So this is, preferably before you've already initiated clinical trials or some of your hypotheses that you want to test about different products. You would engage with patients. Patient input at this stage can be very vital. It's very valuable to have alignment in your research priorities with patients. Patient organizations are generating these days a lot of funding, as well as are able to lobby for a lot of funding for research funding. And so, being aligned with them then gives the possibility of bringing those resources to your own research, but it also might be able to help guide you towards research that you otherwise wouldn't have thought of. It also, once you kind of have some target that you're within the disease, and you think there might be some beneficial effect of a product, you want to make sure that you're actually measuring the things that are relevant to patients. And I alluded to some of the benefits of that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So also, when you're setting your priorities for research, you want to make sure that you're looking at areas relevant to patient care that require improvement that patients actually would describe. Something that often goes into the calculus of approving drugs is whether or not there is an unmet medical need. And there's certainly different benefits that regulatory agents provide to those that are developing drugs to address unmet medical needs. And who better to help assess what those needs are than by talking to patients, understanding the things that are most burdensome in their daily lives, and where they don't have adequate approaches to treatment for those different burdens. And then finally, in the research priority setting kind of arena, the experiences of patients kind of in real life in their own treatment can be really important. So here, in assessing whether there is going to be a potential benefit from your intervention, you can look to see if your trial, as you're starting to begin to think about what your trial will look like, will actually be attractive to patients, both as potential participants in your trial, but again, as also potential funders. So then if we shift from research priority setting into actually moving into designing and planning of your clinical trials, patient input, I think, kind of really low-hanging fruit here, but is not done enough, is really in helping inform protocol design. In this kind of setting, patients can really help you identify what are acceptable comparators. So perhaps whether you will be looking at a standard of care control arm versus a placebo control arm. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. Patients can help identify relevant endpoints using kind of an oncology example here. What is most important to patients given their current unmet need? Would it be treatment-free survival, progression-free survival, or overall survival? There's also a level of risk involved with every clinical trial. So patients can help you identify if your trial is providing an acceptable amount of risk for the potential benefit that they and their community might receive from the trial. And they can also help identify the relevant patient population. And this relates also to helping identify inclusion and exclusion criteria. This is one of the things that often people will rely on inclusion-exclusion criteria that kind of borrow from other studies and aren't thoughtful about this. And this can be one of the biggest mishaps that you can make. You're focusing on what's the trial design going to look like, what are the arms, the treatment and control arms going to look like, what's the duration, what are the endpoints, and you're really forgetting that you might not have the most relevant patient population, or you might be excluding them, and you might not even realize it based off of what your exclusion criteria are. But if you had just talked to the patient community, they would have told you that that was pretty obvious. Patients can also help facilitate the selection and even development of new outcome measures. A lot of the time in rare diseases, we don't have the best outcome measures, especially if we're asking patients what is relevant to them. We might not have the outcome measures to capture those types of things. And so engaging with patients to understand where you might measure some outcome within their daily life, what kind of concept makes most sense to them if you were going to develop a patient-reported outcome can be really important. And then there's just kind of this catch-all of, patients can really help identify potential issues that you might not have otherwise seen. They're another set of eyes, and they're really going to be able to weigh in on lessons learned from other development programs and clinical trials because they've got their ear to the ground and they know what has caused other patient participants to want to enroll or even potentially drop out of other trials. And so you can make sure that you're not kind of putting in unexpected barriers to participation in your trials, but they can also look at things like operational factors. So when you're planning, what kind of support are you going to be providing to patients? How are you going to be, if you actually are selecting your sites, you can, at this point, they can weigh in on what might be relevant locations or what types and distances of travel patients would be willing to take, given the complex lives that they live. So also in the research design and planning stage, securing patient input for communications around your trials is also another opportunity for engagement. If this is the audience of these materials, whether it be kind of recruitment materials about the trials or informed consent documents, who better to assess, kind of the understandability and relatability of those materials than actual patients and patient advocates. They're also in a good place, I think I alluded to this before, of identifying practical considerations, but not just for the general patient community. Even if you talk to the patient organizations, they're going to know where there's geographical differences, and that might be differences in kind of educational level and how that might impact their likelihood to participate in a trial or comply with a trial. It could also relate to the resources, and you might need to dedicate greater resources to support in certain, subpopulations within the patient community. Again, patients can contribute to help, funding and help secure funding, and so this can still, when you're designing your research, if you design it to help answer certain questions, that might then make you eligible for certain funding. And then ultimately, many clinical trial design issues come down to ethical questions, and patients can really help justify decisions made when it comes down to making these kind of ethical determinations about benefits and risks for participation, again, by helping you identify the target population, what endpoints you're measuring, and kind of the burden of all of those outcome measures. And making sure that you're just being, in general, sensitive to the needs of the participants. So the final category related to clinical trial sponsor engagement with patients that I'd like to talk about is once you've actually initiated your trials and you're running them. And so here there's really opportunities to bring patients into the fold of your ongoing monitoring of studies. Patient representatives of the patient community can certainly serve on your trial steering committees. They can participate in investigator meetings. There's a reference to one of those going on this morning where there's being a download of information to investigators. If you have patients participating in that, they might be able to, as you're assessing information, especially information about recruitment and retention in studies, they can help you identify those barriers even after you've started them. And maybe you can get a head start on doing a protocol amendment and change a trial before it becomes an issue. When you do implement a change to your protocol, patients can help you in terms of looking to how you might communicate that, and they might even be able to help to communicate that to the community. This might be especially relevant when there's new safety information and kind of figuring out what is the right way to communicate new risks of adverse events to your patient population. Also, in your data monitoring committees, patients can help you evaluate the impact of study results. This is, very, very important, especially in the regulatory context that I live in. Patients can really help you understand what your results mean. And then that can be very informative to then how you communicate to the Food and Drug Administration or other regulatory agencies what your results mean. In addition, they can help you assess side effects. There's a constant assessment of that going on. And if you need to make decisions, and sometimes these are hard decisions about putting in place additional monitoring or even stopping a trial, certainly you should be engaging with patients to help make those decisions. And then they can also help identify issues related to your formulation administration, what was going to be acceptable in terms of, how often a patient is willing to be dosed with a product, especially if it's a more invasive route of administration, and help you understand issues that can help increase adherence to those dosing regimens, as well as, again, study retention and preventing dropouts. And finally, as you're developing a communication strategy to then communicate results of your trials to the patient community, it would again make sense to engage with patients to help make sure that you're communicating in a clear way, and that the patient community will be able to understand what is being communicated to them. So I gave you kind of quite a few different ways as you're developing and initiating and conducting research to engage with patients. And I wanted to share with you some best practices in terms of how to do that, because it's not good enough to just have a token voice at the table. And any engagement between you as a patient or patient advocate with a sponsor is a relationship, and vice versa. And so, so there's going to be challenges, as there are with any relationships, in having an effective engagement where really the needs of both parties are being fulfilled. And so I had the privilege of serving on a project team, I guess we'll call it, that we went out and surveyed and then did subsequent interviews with those that are conducting clinical trials, both academic investigators and clinical trial sponsors, as well as patient organizations that are engaged in the research space. And we asked them what were the things that led to the most successful engagement. And there were quite a few, but I pulled for today kind of the top 5 things that rose to the top that can help guide your engagement. So first, this one might be obvious, but it often does not happen, which is engaging the patient voice by establishing relationships with the patient community at the beginning of wherever you are, in terms of as early as you can in R&D, but if you have the opportunity at the beginning to do so then. All the reasons that I have already listed, there's the value that's added. But from my experience, patient communities don't really like being called upon only when there's a problem. Only when you are having trouble with recruitment or retention and you need additional patients. It looks like you're just trying to tap the patient community for their human capital. Or when you have bad study results and they're like, come help us salvage this and tell the FDA how important this bad data is, where the data might not have been bad if you had engaged with them earlier. So I think engage early and often is a key best practice. Second is really, when you do engage, clearly define your expectations, roles, and responsibilities. This is just good practice to, be transparent with each other about what resources are being shared in both directions. Patient organizations have a lot of resources, things that they've developed and invested in over time, kind of to help advance the field. What data is being shared, who owns what data, if new data is being generated, and kind of be on the same page about what the objectives of the engagement are. There's nothing worse than having kind of a bad breakup because expectations weren't set early on. Kind of along the same lines, building trust is really important. And doing this is whatever you commit to, actually follow through with that. Again, we're not just paying lip service here. If you're a patient advocate, if you've committed to doing something, and whether it be participating in certain sponsor activities, follow through with that. Don't be a flake. In the same way, if you're a clinical trial sponsor or an investigator, whatever you've promised, stick to that and follow through with the patient community. The fourth thing is involve expertise of multiple partners to help mitigate risk and enrich the pipeline development. So this goes both ways. If you're a patient organization, I've seen this happen way too often, don't just pick your favorite drug in the pipeline or your favorite company developing a drug or your favorite academic medical center you like to work with, and then kind of give them access to your resources and your patient community, but not others. And then the other way around, if you're a sponsor, don't just pick one patient organization to work with. Often different patient organizations or different even individual patients you might be working with represent different parts of the patient population, and they might have different views on all of the different things that we just talked about. And so, in order to kind of do the best that you can in terms of developing the best research protocols and kind of having those good collaborative relationships, I recommend to both sets of stakeholders to engage with the entire universe. Obviously, that's going to be valuable to patients because you want as many options as possible. So it really kind of works against you to put all of your eggs in one basket. And then last, manage real or perceived conflicts of interest. So we're talking about, not-for-profit organizations or even individual patients engaging with either, investigators, academic medical centers, or even drug companies. And so kind of in both directions, when you're establishing your expectations and the kind of bounds of your relationship, make sure you're doing it in a responsible way, where you are protecting kind of your autonomy as a patient community. So that way you don't want to undermine your own voice in other conversations. And kind of the same way, be mindful of that if you're a sponsor, because it might be easy to want to just kind of co-opt activities or just provide the funding kind of in a way where the patient organization might not have full control over that funding. But in the end, is that going to be the best use of time and resources if then it's kind of tainted? So that's what I wanted to share with you about patient engagement with clinical trial sponsors. Now going to turn to patient engagement with regulators, which is what I used to do when I was at FDA and what you're going to hear more about later today. What I do want to say is many of the things that we just talked about actually absolutely apply to engaging with FDA. FDA is advising clinical trial sponsors on all of these things that we just talked about, what studies to conduct, what to do when there's safety issues, how to interpret clinical trial results. So again, that having that information symmetry where there's full understanding of patient experiences and preferences is going to be really important. So that way when FDA is providing input and advice to sponsors, they have the same information that the sponsors have. And some of what I'm going to share about engaging with regulators is also applicable to clinical trial sponsors.
Can you just see if there are any questions about the previous part?
Sure. Yeah. So are there any kind of questions about what I just talked about in terms of engaging with patient engagement with clinical trial sponsors? We can always come back to that as we get to kind of the totality of the presentation, since there is going to be some overlap. Okay. So I think before we kind of talk about some of the framework for engaging in regulatory decisions, I thought it was worth just taking a second to kind of take a step back and say, well, what is first the general framework for FDA's review of medical products? So it's important to remember that FDA reviews medical products on a case-by-case basis when it receives an application. FDA is not developing drugs. They're not conducting clinical trials. They're there as kind of gatekeepers or protectors of the public health to make sure that research is being conducted in a responsible way that could lead to an approvable or support for an application for approval. And then ultimately they're assessing that information to make those approval decisions. And so if you think about that, there's two ways that patients and caregivers of patients can contribute to that decision making. You could consult and advise on specific development programs and applications at FDA, and there's certain programs set up to actually bring the patient voice to those individual types of discussions. But you can also provide general input about your experiences and preferences that can help guide development programs and approval decisions that don't involve talking about any particular drug development program or application. And that's more of what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm purposefully staying away from talking about particular programs for doing this because I know later today, FDA will be here to share more information about specific ways to engage with them. So really what I'm going to be talking about is helping set the context for benefit risk decisions. When FDA makes an approval decision, the decision it's making is a judgment that the benefits of the product outweigh the potential benefits of the product outweigh the potential risks. So it's, kind of, do the benefits tip the scale and outweigh the risks? Obviously, that's very subjective. It's going to depend heavily on the disease and how severe it is, what the level of need for treatment is, as well as many other things. For example, how rare the condition is and what level of kind of information then could be generated from that community. And so in order to make those decisions, FDA has to kind of have this contextual understanding of the disease. And you might think FDA, they're scientists, they're clinicians, they're healthcare professionals, but it's impossible. There's 7,000 plus known diseases. It's impossible for FDA officials, any individual FDA official, to know every disease, even within, say rheumatology. It's impossible for a rheumatologist reviewer at FDA to know every possible condition under that umbrella. And so really it becomes then the responsibility, I would say the responsibility of the patient community to help ensure that FDA has that information. Often medical literature can be very limited in addressing and kind of categorizing and establishing the kind of understanding natural history and really the daily impacts of a disease. And so this is where really patients can help fill that gap and be really a resource to the agency. And so kind of generally speaking, to help set this context, there's two main categories of information that FDA would be looking for to help them make those types of benefit risk decisions. The first is what is helping understand the disease and its impact on patients' daily lives. So this helps them understand the severity of the condition. Also, a lot of more nuanced issues related to how the condition actually manifests and it impacts patients. But you're really helping kind of helping them take a step back about what they understand about the disease, and you're establishing that for them. In meetings that I've had where a patient community has met with FDA, the FDA reviewers have walked away sometimes saying, oh, that really confirmed what I understand or thought I understood about the disease. Many other times they actually say, wow, like I totally misunderstood this hallmark of the disease that clearly, is what patients are saying is their, top one or two, kind of issues. I had no idea. Maybe it was their own personal bias of their own background. You don't really know. So that's why it's important to bring kind of that type of understanding to FDA. The other is helping FDA understand the adequacy of available therapies. So what things are you doing to try to help treat your disease? This might include approved products. This might include off-label uses of approved products. This might include over-the-counter drugs, dietary supplements, even things like diet, exercise, more holistic approaches to treatment, or even lifestyle modifications. All of these things are important to help FDA understand what is the current standard of your personal standard of care for trying to treat therapies. Obviously, clinicians will have some idea of that, but they have a limited scope of when they get to see what is going on in your life. And so really, it's up to you as patients and patient advocates to help really bring that full understanding. And ultimately, this will help FDA understand what benefits matter most to patients, and I'll explain why that ends up becoming important. About 5 years ago, the same time that a lot of this patient engagement was happening at the agency, FDA also came out with a structured benefit risk assessment framework. I have it here. It's in your handouts. Really, the takeaway here is this is a tool for FDA to actually document the things that were relevant to its decisions related to whether the benefits of a drug outweigh the risks. And as you can see, the bottom three rows actually are benefit risk and ways to manage risks. And this is information that's generated from the clinical trials that are being conducted. So this is kind of the more objective scientific information. But the first two rows, before an FDA official is ever starting to look at benefits and risks, they need to provide an analysis of the condition and what is the unmet medical need. And as you can see, those are the two topics I just talked about being really important to share with FDA. And so if that information is provided to FDA, what they can do is pre-populate those fields with what patients have said is important. Here's an example from lung cancer where there was a particular type of meeting called a patient-focused drug development meeting where the patient community was able to come together, share their experiences, share their preferences about treatments, and FDA was able to populate this. And now any new kind of new product for lung cancer, the first thing that a reviewer is going to see when they're filling in this benefit risk framework is what patients had to say about their own condition, about their unmet need for that condition. So what this does is, here's just another diagram of the drug development life cycle. Again, from the left, kind of being your basic science and research, moving into some translational, preclinical, the animal studies, and then into the clinic in the darker green, and ultimately an application which is called an NDA or BLA submitted to FDA for them to review. So helping inform that benefit risk framework helps inform that NDA, that marketing application that is being submitted to help FDA decide whether or not to approve that drug. But as you can see, that comes very late in the game, and there's all this time that is before that where there's no arrow showing where the patient voice is making an impact. So I also want to talk about how that same information, understanding the disease and the burdens of the disease, and your approaches to treating the disease and what the unmet medical need is, can actually inform development earlier and help contribute to FDA's understanding of different outcomes in clinical trials. Kind of one of the main categories of outcomes or endpoints that are measured in clinical trials are clinical outcome assessments. These are measures of how a patient feels or functions. And it's a very broad kind of term, but it can be a measure of performance, some kind of functional performance that could be measured oftentimes in the clinic. It could be something that a clinician observes and rates. It could be something that an observer, such as a caregiver, an adult parent of a pediatric patient, might report, or it's something that a patient reports themselves. What it is not is a survival measure. So survival kind of falls outside of this umbrella of clinical outcome assessments, and so do biomarkers, which you hear a lot about, especially in early research before you've moved into the clinic, where you're looking at particular measures within the body to try to assess activity of the drug. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about real measures of how a patient feels or functions. And this is, in addition to survival, the types of things that FDA looks to see in order to be used in adequate and well-controlled studies to support approval. So specifically, the types of information that we've been talking about, how does that inform clinical outcome assessments? Well, there's a number of things that when you're developing a clinical outcome assessment that you have to show in order to use that outcome measure in your clinical trial. Here's three that I think really directly relate to what information patients can provide. So first, what is the right concept of interest to measure? Are you measuring the right burden, the right symptom, the right outcome of how a patient feels or functions? The right one being the one that's important to patients. Second, what opportunities to measure whatever that burden or symptom is, what opportunities are there to measure that within the patient's daily life? When you measure something is really important, and being able to come up with a clinical outcome assessment, you might need to find one that's specific to how a disease manifests in a particular patient population. Certain symptoms might only be present at certain times, or there might be certain things that drive symptoms or burdens. And so you need to make sure that you're selecting clinical outcome measures that account for those types of things. And so listening to patients and listening to how those symptoms manifest is really important for that. And really, this third one is one of the most important things, which is really how do you know when you then get a result on that outcome measure, what is considered clinically meaningful? Because it's not enough to have a super marginal response that maybe you've done a study in a lot of patients, so you have a statistically significant finding. So you can mark it that you have a p-value of less than 0.05. But it's, how do we know that whatever that difference between the group that was treated versus the group that was in the control, like on placebo, for example, that difference was a meaningful difference? And that's something that FDA looks at, and that's something that FDA looks to patients to help identify what is meaningful. Because who can really say what is going to be meaningful when if you experience that benefit, then you, the patient yourself. So what this does is it allows the patient voice to be utilized earlier in drug development. Again, very early, well before you've started clinical trials, in identifying and even developing new clinical outcome assessments. But then also as you're starting to get results from trials and you're assessing that clinical meaningfulness, that then becomes important and helps then feed into those benefit-risk decisions. So I just wanted to quickly share with you 3 examples of how some of these things have, how kind of the patient voice has really made an impact in 3 different ways. So the first is in Pompe disease. So this is a disease of kind of progressive muscle weakness. Patients become progressively weak. They don't gain muscle strength back. You would think that this was actually one of the very first diseases that I worked on when I was at FDA. You would think that is obvious now that maintaining what you currently have, or even slowing the progression of a disease that's uniformly progressive, is a benefit to patients. But that was not necessarily obvious in the past. And so when a product for Pompe disease was being reviewed by FDA, the patient representative, so the individual with Pompe disease that was advising the agency, kind of made this statement that, it's not that we're looking necessarily for a benefit, but actually, we would welcome and are willing to take on risk of a product if that gives us some delay or slowing of the progression. And in a public advisory committee meeting where FDA was looking to kind of outside experts to weigh in on this, FDA kind of re-brought up those words that the patient said and asked the advisory committee to take that into consideration when they were then providing their input on whether the benefits of the product outweighed the risks. Ultimately, that product was approved, and since then, additional products have been developed and even approved for Pompe disease. So that, to me, is a really important success story. And I think it goes to show that having patients be part of the process, you can't ever anticipate what's going to be the value of their participation. But if you don't have them there, you can't ever realize that value. And so thankfully, FDA was proactive, had a patient representative advising them during the review, and was able to kind of have that aha moment for Pompe disease. The second is the therapeutic context. So this relates to the 2 categories of information I was talking about, the burdens of disease and the unmet medical need. Well, what was kind of interesting was at another one of these public meetings, these patient-focused drug development meetings that was for Huntington's disease. The Huntington's disease patient community came together to meet with FDA, but the Huntington's Disease Society of America, the patient organization, had actually conducted a survey of both patients and clinicians, asking them to rank what they believe to be the most burdensome aspects of the disease. And they presented these results as part of this meeting to help kind of facilitate the discussion. And what was really interesting was there was really discordance between what it was that patients said was important and what clinicians thought was important. And it's not to say that, I'm not trying to say that what clinicians believe to be important is invaluable to assessing benefits of drugs or designing trials. But if you didn't ask the patients, you might be missing information about what's important otherwise. So here, what happened was, the clinicians treating Huntington's disease patients had said that language, speaking, was kind of I think it was the number one thing that they rated as being most burdensome to patients. The patients believed that they spoke just fine. They had no problem. They were like, I can communicate just fine. Like, I don't see that as a problem. Actually, for me, it's not something as specific as that. It's generally how the disease impacts my ability to either pursue education or be a part of the workforce. And so, as you can imagine, maybe speaking has some impact on that, but there's many other symptoms of Huntington's disease. And so maybe if just this actually hasn't happened, but kind of theoretically, if you only measured kind of speech as an outcome, maybe you're going to be missing a lot of what's important to patients and what really burdens patients than if you use something that might be more general, like some kind of broader quality of life measure or patient-reported outcome that maybe captures a number of different impacts of the disease. And then lastly, this is in migraines. You think migraines equal, headache, really terrible pain. But actually, there's other manifestations of migraines. There's photophobia, or sensitivity to light, and phonophobia, sensitivity to sound. And so what FDA did here was actually gave guidance to drug developers and said, if you're developing a new drug for migraine, we want to measure things that are important to patients. And instead of trying to have you measure everything, when not everything might be relevant to every patient, not every patient experiences photo and phonophobia in addition to pain. Maybe often it's only one or the other. Why don't we ask each patient that's going to be in the trial which of those things is most, in addition to the pain, is most burdensome to them? And then you can use that as a co-primary endpoint, even though not every patient in the study is going to have the same kind of second endpoint. Everyone's going to have pain. There might be something, differences in what the other endpoint is based off of what is most burdensome to them. And so, this is kind of really at the most grassroots level of asking patients for their input to make sure that we're measuring what's clinically meaningful and relevant to patients. That's one thing to consider when designing trials. How can we be creative to make sure we really are being kind of as precise as possible in capturing what is going to be most beneficial to patients? So with that, I just want to reiterate that for all of this, I think it's important not just for patient engagement with just clinical trial sponsors or just FDA. I've seen it happen way too many times where patient groups are engaged with industry or a academician that's conducting research. They then go into FDA, not the patient, but the sponsor, and propose some development program that's based on the input that they received, but the underlying assumptions for that research design don't match the underlying assumptions of FDA reviewers, and it's not their fault. It's just that they have not been provided the same information. Vice versa, I've seen it where patient groups have been really engaged with the agency, and the agency is trying to kind of push the envelope to make sure new drug development is patient-centric. You have these patient-centric endpoints. And industry just, the sponsor just does not understand where this is coming from, and they're worried that there's going to be a lot of risk in doing what the agency is asking. But perhaps if they had just reached out to patients, they would understand as well. So I'm happy to take questions or even experiences or comments that you might have related to your own experiences, whether it be participating in clinical trials and maybe how, if you had the opportunity to provide input, that might have made sense. Obviously, there's a lot of sponsors and investigators in the room, so your experiences here, certainly even just them being heard today can be valuable. But also, if you have kind of questions, there's a lot I didn't cover, so I'm sure we can talk more about it. Yes, and are we doing? Yeah, I think a mic is coming.
Thanks for your talk.
Mhm.
And agree that involving patients in all these levels would be very helpful and eye-opening for us as clinicians. I wonder if you could maybe speak about a slightly different topic, which is we're interested to learn more about compassionate use of drugs and how that process works, and does that impact the decision-making of the FDA regarding approval for drugs, and how does that impact and sort of the legality around that? If
Yeah.
you could shed some light on that, that'd be very helpful.
Sure. So the question was about compassionate use of investigational drugs. So once a drug is approved on the market, it's indicated for a certain indication or patient population for a particular use. FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine, so if a product is used off-label, that's kind of, falls into more of the regulation of how healthcare practitioners are practicing within their own standard of care. But when we're talking about an investigational product, there's not the same access to that product outside of how it's being used, for example, in clinical trials. In order to be able to access a product outside of a clinical trial, there has to be what's called compassionate use, or under FDA's regulations, called expanded access. And so this is really a program that allows patients that meet certain criteria. Generally, the criteria is that it has to be a serious or life-threatening disease where you've exhausted available treatment options, you're not eligible for a current clinical trial, and your treating physician thinks that the investigational product for you, the benefit risk is there given whatever level of information there is about the benefits and risks of the product. And so there's actually a way through FDA for treating physicians, if a company is willing to provide a product, an investigational product, to this patient, whether it be for the exact kind of disease that they're studying in clinical trials, or sometimes for other diseases, to be able to, they themselves set up and basically be an N of, a single patient, an N of one IND, which is, really the mechanism that allows investigational products to be used. But unlike clinical trials, it's not research, it's considered treatment. And so there's just a very different context to how that use of products is considered by the agency. And so, if you have a product that a company is willing to provide to your patient, or if you're a patient to you, and you have a physician that's willing to treat you, you can actually submit. There's actually a streamlined form for this on FDA's website, where basically you put in information about your kind of the background on the the patient and where they're at, why they kind of meet this FDA criteria for expanded access, and what you're proposing, basically your mini protocol for how you're going to use this product in the patient. In addition to that, you also have to get IRB review. So if you're at an institution, you can have your institution's IRB do this IRB review, or if you're kind of an independent practitioner, you can use kind of a third-party private IRB. So the patient still has to go undergo informed consent, and then ultimately they can, if FDA approves the expanded access request, they can access that product for that treatment use. FDA, I think, approves 99% of the applications. It beats its deadline of 30 days for reviewing applications regularly. Essentially, for probably most things that you're thinking of, if you are lucky enough to have a company that's willing to give you the product to use, you're likely going to get FDA approval of your expanded access request. So the second part of your question was, how does that impact kind of assessment of those products, if any? So there's always, anytime you give an investigational product to a patient, there's always the chance that something bad is going to happen. And if something bad happens, there's an obligation to report that to FDA. The question is, does something bad happening to a patient that's outside of a clinical trial, by definition, is likely sicker because they have exhausted treatment therapies, they're outside of the inclusion criteria for a clinical trial, how is FDA going to use that? Well, FDA, doesn't have it's outside of their legal authority to ignore it. They can't just say, oh yeah, we're not going to look at that information coming into us. But my experience has been that FDA looks at it in that very specific context. I don't think there has ever been an example where a drug was not approved because of some safety risk. I believe there have been clinical holds, so a trial has been temporarily stopped due to safety input coming in from expanded access. But I believe in all of those situations, those trials were able to eventually resume. And I think kind of at the time of approval, kind of the worst that has happened from kind of maybe a sponsor's perspective is that information about that adverse event goes into the labeling. So that way it's listed as a possible risk of the product.
Maybe as a sponsor, I can actually make a comment on that as well. As AB2 Bio, my company, we do a lot of compassionate use. There's actually very little in it for the actual company. You risk, as the gentleman said, actually having your label, adverse events, putting your label. And as far as the authorities are concerned with associated efficacy, you get no value at all. You have the only efficacy you can actually get is through a proper clinical trial. So the actual compassionate use, you cannot generate efficacy data with that.
Right.
Not that the agency will look at. You can do things that make you feel better and actually show you, yes, the drug works, maybe, but the agency will not actually accept that as evidence.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So just to recap that.
Sometimes it gets turned over.
Yeah. Recap that statement. From the sponsor's perspective, it was said that the sponsor has very little to gain from doing expanded access, other than just providing that service to patients in need. But in terms of advancing their development program, they don't really get anything because FDA is not. You don't have outcome measures. You're not studying how the drug is performing from a benefit perspective. The only thing that you potentially get is this, adverse event information that can impact your label. I think that was kind of the recap from the sponsor's perspective, from a sponsor that does provide compassionate use.
So just to sort of follow up on that, because for me, I feel like here's a place where advocacy is important, particularly with what we're discussing in here about rare disease and potentially fatal disease. And so I think I totally appreciate the dilemma that the sponsors are in with expanded access programs, because it is essentially all risk and no benefit to them from their perspective, and I think that that's fair. And yet I think it's important to be able to have that kind of program. Mm-hmm. What is the opportunity for patients and their voice to educate the FDA about, is there a way to de-risk it in any way for these sponsors to allow that important modality of therapy being delivered to patients? Because I think that it's a huge roadblock, right? And I think that on the one hand, the mission of the FDA is to protect the patients, mm-hmm. And in here, that protection is maybe getting in the way. And so I've actually had, in another rare disease group, a mother come up to me and say, I want to be protected, I just don't want to be protected to death. Mm-hmm. And that's really what I think often ends up happening.
Yeah, so it's a interesting question about what role can patient advocacy play surrounding expanded access. Kind of not directly addressing your question, but an important point to make is patient advocacy can definitely play a role in helping kind of operationalize expanded access. Often there's limited supply of product that's available, or limited resources to produce product to be available for expanded access. So patient advocacy organizations can step up and help be kind of administrator of expanded access, whether that be by administering lottery programs or even helping work with an IRB, which is being done in some cases, to actually review requests for expanded access to see if they meet kind of the kind of a fairness principle in terms of making sure the patients most in need of the products are going to be the ones getting them. In terms of advocating to FDA, you know, I think my experience has been that FDA has been very reasonable in how it's looked at adverse event information when there has been any generated from expanded access. You know, I think FDA really understands, for example, if there's going to be a clinical hold, the repercussions of that. That's not just some kind of like administrative thing. You know, you've got patients that are currently being treated. Do you keep treating them? You know, what do you do about collection of information? What does this do to the company in terms of being able to, you know, viably, you know, restart that trial and continue recruiting? You know, it's not something taken lightly by FDA. You know, so, you know, I would say if there ever is a situation where this occurs, and you have a relationship with a sponsor that it shares that information with you, then perhaps there's appropriate kind of communication of your kind of risk tolerance for that type of particular risk to the agency. But by and large, yeah, I mean, I think it's something like less than 1% have had clinical holds, or products that have had expanded access have resulted in a clinical hold. The numbers aren't known about labels being affected, but at the end of the day, that's not stopping approval of the drug. The drug's still being approved. That's just information then for you and your clinician to take into account when you're making your personal benefit risk decision.
So we're actually just a little bit past time. Rashmi, what would you like to say?
Do we have other 2 more questions? We can do that next week.
Sure.
A brief comment and then a question. I'm not completely sure I buy the argument that you get nothing out of it when you learn something of using a novel drug for a novel therapy, because that may push you down that road. But
Yeah.
my question is, how much are patient advocacy groups aware of, or how much have they pushed for more centralized IRB, which is a huge burden to any kind of clinical trial? Mm-hmm. And are they aware of it? How much are they aware of it? Are the bulk of them aware of it? And what can they do to help resolve? As a lawyer, you can help us with this, because it usually comes down to lawyers at various state or institutional levels that block all these or make all these roadblocks.
Yeah, institutional lawyers give us a bad name, I think. So the question about central IRBs. So patient advocacy organizations are aware of it, especially a lot of the patient organizations that have been engaged in the research kind of arena for a long time. And in fact, they've been huge proponents of central IRBs. Recently, the federal government did a kind of a reform of the Common Rule, which oversees any kind of federally funded or supported research. What are the protections for human subjects? And as part of that, there's actually been included in that it's not I don't believe it's a full requirement, but a push for central IRBs. And that's similarly, FDA kind of regulation operates separate from the Common Rule. So FDA regulated studies, FDA is currently working on a similar reform to its regulations, but has largely received the same input. But of course, there's still continued opportunity to influence that. In terms of specific, kind of individual patient communities, that is, kind of absolutely something that they can help push for, especially if they're a collaborator in the research. It's going to be hard because you have to fight every institution, and if it's not required, often institutions want to try to protect themselves, really not to protect, I'll say this, a lot of what goes into informed consent in IRB review, from IRB review now, is not really to protect the individual, but to protect the institution. And so, I think working with the sponsors of studies to kind of help, put pressure to have a central IRB can be really valuable. The other thing perhaps that you could do is have at least central IRB review of, of kind of a shortened, more patient-friendly informed consent form. I don't know that all aspects of the IRB review you'll be able to claw out of away from institutions, but perhaps the pieces that are most important and relevant to patients, which is not being overwhelmed by this lengthy legal document, perhaps you can create the basically the preface to that is a simpler, more patient-friendly version that can be provided with the individual institution informed consent. So I wish I could say you can definitely make it happen, but certainly if you're not pushing for that and working with your investigators to try to convince their institutions, it's not going to happen. So until there's that kind of outside pressure, kind of status quo will be maintained.
I have a very quick follow-up question to that.
Mhm.
So are there examples of patient organizations that have kind of put together a central IRB? Are there examples of patient organizations that have put together a central IRB and then work with all the institutions and try to streamline that?
So I don't know of specific examples of where a patient organization has, either in research that they're conducting or funding, had a central IRB. But I think it's certainly something that you as a patient organization, if you're, just like any other contributor, to the research, that could be something you could put as a requirement of the research. And what that might mean is some institutions wouldn't be able to participate because they just can't convince the institution to kind of release control. But perhaps it's enough if there's dollars to it. That's the other thing that helps drive institutions to make change, because obviously that's an important thing to them, is to keep research funding and clinical trials, having their institutions be clinical trial sites. So if it's your money, you leverage that money. Yep.
A question about FDA's stance on approving biosimilars.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded, thank you. Reminded when Raj did his video presentation from India and talked about, no treatments valuable if the patients can't afford it.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the biologics that so much focuses on here in our country, is India, everywhere, are expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that FDA has been pretty slow compared to Europe in approving biosimilars. Can you give us any insights into what a group like this might be able to do to help or to understand better what FDA's thinking is and how more biosimilars can be on the market to improve access?
Right. I guess this is really, at least in the United States, biosimilars regulation is still evolving. FDA actually, is still continuing not just individual reviews of, biosimilar applications, but still meeting to try to, further establish its requirements. So there is more regulatory certainty and there is more precedent, which will then lead to kind of eventually more expeditious biosimilar approval. So I would say for patient organizations to not just be engaged on specific development programs, but actually to engage FDA and let them know what their needs are in terms of biosimilars and what they're willing to accept in terms of some of the regulatory standards that are being established on how similar those products need to be, or really weighing in on what FDA should be considering. I would absolutely encourage patient communities that have a potential pipeline of biosimilars to aid them to be engaged, not to try to engage in kind of those higher level policy discussions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I was just